or good evening, everyone. I'm Arietta Papaconstantinou. I teach Roman and late antique history at the University of Reading in the UK. And I was quite excited to see this book come out in May. So I'm going to introduce Gillian Spalding, who is an honorary postdoctoral associate at Macquarie University in Sydney. In the Department of History and Archaeology, where she completed her PhD in 2018 after a career in adult education and corporate communication. She returned to academia after that. She's the recipient of the 2021 Macquarie Tyndale Scholarship at Cambridge, which we all hope she will be able to take up at some point in 2021. We all hope we'll be able to travel eventually. While at Tyndale, she'll be working on the liturgical basis for the design of early baptismal fonts, a very interesting subject to me at least, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. But this is a side project. She's actually started working on a major project which will result in a second monograph bearing on the Divine Mother Mary in interfaith visual expression. Interfaith because she will be exploring the dichotomies in Marian imagery in a Christian context by examining representations of Mariam in Islamic visual expression, and will include studies on the conflation of Mary and Kuan Yin from the Silk Road cultures and Mary as a bountiful mother goddess type in India, something that has not been done before and would be sounds really exciting. I think we all look forward to seeing this in a future Edinburgh Book Festival. Now back from the future to now, the book she's presenting today, The Cross in the Visual Culture of Late Antique Egypt, is a reworking of her doctoral thesis and was published, as I said, in May 2020. It reflects her interest in visual expression as a means to understanding issues of assimilation and cultural concordance, especially in the ancient world, where generally only the elite had access to the written word. So how images function as a system of signs as well. Now, the book offers a journey around Egypt from north to south and brings to the fore a fascinating variety of motifs for crosses. It is, I mean, to me, it was absolutely incredible. I've been seeing images, Egyptian images from late antiquity for many, many years, but seeing them all together, you get this incredible feeling of how creative one could become with what in the end is finally just two intersecting lines. It reminded me very much in a different way of, you know, of the inventivity, if that word exists, of illuminated initials in medieval manuscripts. Now, bringing our attention to this is one of the merits of this book, because one can no longer just pass and see crosses and say, oh, a cross. It is no longer a given, but it is a just semiotically simple part of visual culture. We now have a collection, analysis, typology, and cultural assessment of the various forms it can take in Egyptian Christian art. So in that sense, I think this is a book that will be a reference for a long time to come for art historians, and probably not only art historians, or hopefully not only art historians. I think I'll pass the floor, or rather, well, the screen to Gillian, as she can speak about her book much better than I can. So Gillian, you're
Thank you, Arietta, for that lovely introduction. And good morning or good afternoon or wherever you are. It's actually evening. It's 9 p.m. as Andrew said, here in Sydney, where I am. So firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers of the festival for coming up with this excellent idea, because as you know, anyone who published last year, we couldn't actually launch any of our material. And so thank you also for accepting my book into the programme. And I'd also like to thank Petros for providing the suggested format, some guidelines as to the material that the presenters are going to cover, and also to him, and in particular to NASA for the technical support, because I believe NASA is going to be sharing my slides, because I was a bit technologically challenged earlier in the week. My book, which looks like this. NASA, we can probably have the slide a little bit later, thank you. Yeah, anyway, so my book, which was published by Brill in May 2020, originated as a doctoral thesis, as Arietta said. My two abiding interests are in human communication and religious art, and I was able to bring these two elements together in my doctoral work. In essence, I've always had an interest in ancient religious art, which was a means of communication when not everyone had access to the written word. In fact, only the elite did. Others express themselves usually orally or visually. They're not necessarily in what we might describe as art, because the artistic merit of an object it's a very subjective thing. And, you know, definitely in the eye of the beholder. And yet others then in the ancient world, they learned about their faith, and in this instance, in a Christian context, through, I should say, reading or interpreting such visual representations. So one of the questions that Petros suggested was, how long did it take to put this whole thing together? So my doctoral thesis was done both part-time and full-time, and it took 4 years to complete. And I spent a further year doing a complete rewrite and a revision of the material to make it into the monograph that was published. The project, focusing on the crosses of late antique Egypt, it was of a type, as Arietta suggested, it was of a type that had not been done before. So I had to actually create my main research resource, which was a collection of images, because you can't start to analyze images until you actually have a significant collection or database of images. So I used archaeological reports dating, you know, way back to 18th century onwards, when we had the early French and English archaeologists in Egypt. And eventually I ended up with some 500 images, which unfortunately could not be published. Certainly the constraints of the book wouldn't permit the publishing of 500 images. But there was also the cost constraints of obtaining copyright, because a lot of the images actually owned by museums or, you know, other institutions. So the 26, I had the difficult decision of culling, going from 500 images in my collection to the 26 images that appear in my book. And which was, you know, it was like, it was an extremely difficult process. And I had to choose images for the book which actually told more than one story. And I also had to jettison a number of other graphics that I developed, which I used in my dissertation, which also told a story. For example, I mapped the timeline of the monasteries and the type of art expression that I was seeing against other historical events that were happening in the Byzantine world. Unfortunately, the book format didn't allow for those to be included. But having said that, it was an absolute pleasure working with Brill, my publisher. They were so patient with the whole process. So I chose to study the design of crosses in late antique Egypt, broadly the period from the 4th to the 12th century, though I did by necessity have to look at stuff on either side of that timeline. I have to note that I'm very cautious of the use of the word Coptic, because Christian visual expression in Egypt extends well after the Coptic era, in fact, into the well beyond the Islamic period. And I chose to study this area firstly because the corpus of crosses in Egypt, especially in the Byzantine period, is very rich and varied, probably more so than anywhere else that I'd encountered. And it displays many possible influences, including indigenous Egyptian forms of expression. The second reason for choosing this topic was that it was students of Christian Egypt tend to focus on papyrus and scribal work. And I thought, and I still do believe, that the study of visual expression gives an additional insight into social structures, contexts, and beliefs. And thirdly, I noted from the archaeological reports that they mention visual expression, but the crosses themselves are just considered so ubiquitous that they were often overlooked. And you might find a very eminent archaeologist who would say, oh, and in the apse, there's a painting of a cross, and just leave it at that. And I find that intriguing because the cross is actually the fundamental symbol of Christianity, and you would think that people would accord it more importance or more detail than we actually ever saw. So the book then, it basically turned on a survey of the monasteries, ecclesiastical buildings, and other sites, including cemeteries, which contained what I consider to be significant representations of crosses. And obviously there's a subjective element there in what I deem to be significant. So basically what I thought was significant is where the cross was a dominant feature at a particular site. Like, for example, at Kelia, the crosses are just so prolific at Kelia, you can't sort of get away from them. Or I thought if the cross was a dominant feature in a particular composition, like in a tableau, the cross was a central feature, I considered that dominant or significant. And also I chose crosses which displayed a particular evolution of design. So most of my research therefore relied on archaeological report and related reports, because of course some of the sites that I'm talking about or that I talk about in the book are no longer in existence. In some instances, we do still have those ancient monasteries and churches, but the visual expressions sometimes have changed. They've been plastered over. If you go to St. Anthony's Monastery in the Red Sea, you can see where some of that restoration work has stripped away the later layers of plaster, and you can see two versions of a cross, like an earlier version and a later version. Or in some instances, crosses or images of Jesus have been replaced by images of the Virgin Mary. And so you don't actually see what the original was. So in a way, that was a bit of a challenge as well. So the survey, which before I could come to any kind of analysis about the crosses, it took the best part of a year, and that included the collection of the images. So once I had completed the survey and the images, I could then turn my mind to an analysis and developing a typology based on the designs. And my analysis showed that there were essentially 4 types of crosses in each. You could actually bring everything down to those 4 types. And they were the Anzac cross, the crux ansata, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. The Latin cross, where it's probably the most recognizable cross today, where the vertical axis is a little bit longer than the horizontal. The Greek cross, where the vertical and the horizontal are equal. And the Pate cross, which is sometimes called Maltese, but it's not a Maltese cross. Maltese cross is something different. The Pate cross is essentially like a Greek cross, which has got 4 equal, it's 2 equal lines intersected in the middle, but in the Pate cross, it flares out rather than the Greek cross, which is like 4 rectangles. The Pate cross, it's more into a triangular shape of arm there. So with the analysis and the typology, I was then able to look at an analysis of geographic location across Egypt, like where in Egypt did these different types occur, which was the dominant type in which location in Egypt. I was then able to analyze it by where in the churches and monasteries, like for example, was this in the apse, or was it in the body of the church, or in which part of the monastery? Was it in a more public area, in a refectory, for example, an oratory niche? Was it in a private monk's cell? And in some instances in Egypt, you see very professionally painted crosses, but in an unlikely location, which might have belonged to, in one instance in Kelia, a junior monk, which then of course tells you that obviously people had access to funds to pay for professional painters, you know, and it actually was quite an interesting revelation. So coming to influence, the Byzantine influence was clear, especially in the use of the representation of processional crosses. Like for example, in Constantinople and other kind of wealthy parts of the Byzantine Empire, people would have used real gold and silver and precious metal crosses embedded with gemstones, which they would have taken in procession in churches and in other public arenas. In Egypt, which is very much, I guess, the poorer relation, where the churches were basically mud brick buildings, and they didn't have access to funds to have, you know, glittering gold crosses. But what they did do was actually paint crosses on walls, paint processional crosses. And Nasa, if you wouldn't mind showing my first slide, we have an example of, on slide 1, a processional cross, which has actually been painted on a wall in Kelia. And this, Kelia, yes, thank you. And Kelia as a site doesn't exist anymore. And this is one of 2 crosses from the entire site which has been preserved. This is in the Museum of the Bibliothèque Alexandrina in Alexandria. And the reason why I know it's a processional cross is that you can see at the bottom of the cross there's a protrusion or a tang. And this suggests that a cross like this would have been inserted into a shaft or a staff to enable somebody to actually carry it at the head of a procession. The most interesting and fascinating part of my research was about the development and use of the crux ansata, or the Anzac cross, which we see on the next slide. This is a crux ansata, which is essentially a T-shaped device with a circle on top of it. And crux ansata from the Latin meaning cross with a handle. It's in English, Anzac cross. Some of my colleagues refer to it as an Ankh cross because of the visual similarity to the Egyptian Ankh. Unfortunately, I didn't put in a slide with an Ankh, but in an Ankh, the loop is more of an ovoid shape. And the Ankh in is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, which signifies life. And in this instance, this is from the Codex Glacier. It's an end piece from the 6th century from Oxyrhynchus, part of the Morgan Library and Museum in the US. And particularly fine example, and you can see like the Byzantine influence there with the birds, even though you don't ever see an Anzac cross in the Byzantine world.
You should come to a conclusion.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the next slide, I'll just go very quickly, Arietta. The next slide shows also an Anzac cross. And okay, I won't talk too much more about this, but I guess the most intriguing and fascinating part of this is why the Anzac cross disappeared from use in Egypt. So from the 8th century onwards, you don't see this. So the first expressions are from the 4th and 5th century. We see it right through to the 8th and then it disappears. And Nasa, if you can just show my very last slide, this is slide 6. So this is a Roman sarcophagus. The next slide after this. So this is 10th century. So by the 10th century, the Anzac cross basically has disappeared from the design lexicon, and you're left with this kind of very elaborate, in this instance, Latin cross, which is from the Fayum. So this is the big mystery as to why this happened. Why did the Anzac cross disappear? Was it because it was considered to have pagan connotations? Was it the Arab influence? We don't know, but it's something that perhaps a student could pick up on. So in conclusion, I hope that my book will be of interest and value to art historians and students of Christian religious expression in the Near East and the Byzantine world. And I hope it demonstrates that we need to look beyond the written word in our attempt to better understand the ancients. Thank you.